Judge Emily Harrison rubbed her tired eyes as she sat behind the tall wooden bench in the busy London courthouse. The morning had been long and filled with one case after another. At 52 years old, she had been working as a judge for more than 10 years. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her heavy black robes made her look very serious and important to everyone in the courtroom. The clock on the wall showed it was already past noon. Emily had been listening to traffic violations, small theft cases, and other minor crimes all morning. She was hungry, tired, and ready for her lunch break. The courtroom was stuffy, and she could feel a headache starting behind her eyes. "Next case, please," Emily called out, shuffling through the papers on her desk without much interest. The court clerk, a thin man with glasses, stood up and read from his list. "Traffic violation case number 4127. Miss Grace Williams." Emily looked up briefly as a young black woman walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s and wore a simple blue dress that looked clean but not expensive. She carried a small purse and walked with her back straight, showing quiet dignity despite being in this uncomfortable situation. Emily glanced down at the papers in front of her. The file showed that Grace Williams had been caught speeding 20 miles over the speed limit on a busy road in central London last month. It was a clear violation, and Emily had handled hundreds of similar cases over the years. "Miss Williams," Emily said in a stern voice, not bothering to look up from her papers to really see Grace as a person, "I see here that you were driving 20 miles over the speed limit. This is completely unacceptable behavior." Grace stood quietly in front of the judge's bench. She kept her hands clasped together in front of her and said nothing. She had learned from experience that it was often better to remain silent in situations like this. Emily continued reading from the file, making assumptions about Grace based on her appearance and the fact that she was representing herself. "I notice you don't have a lawyer with you today," the judge said, her voice becoming more condescending. "Perhaps if you took more responsibility for your actions and made better choices, you wouldn't find yourself in this position." The words hit Grace like a slap. She had actually been rushing to an extremely important meeting with government officials about prison reform when she was caught speeding. She was passionate about helping people who were trapped in the criminal justice system, and that meeting could have helped change policies that affected thousands of lives. But Grace chose not to explain this to the judge. She had been in similar situations before and had learned that sometimes silence was the safest response. Emily felt satisfied with her lecture. She believed she was teaching this young woman an important lesson about following the law. "The speed limit exists for good reasons," she continued. "It protects everyone on the road. When people like you ignore these rules, you put innocent lives at risk." Grace bit her lip but remained silent. She wanted to explain that she was normally a very careful driver, that she had been distracted by thoughts of the important work she was doing. But she knew the judge had already made up her mind about what kind of person she was. "I'm going to fine you the maximum amount allowed by law," Emily declared, feeling pleased with herself for being tough on crime. £500 plus court costs. "That brings your total to £600. Grace felt her heart sink. £600 was a lot of money, even for someone in her position. She thought about all the people she had represented over the years who could never afford such a fine, people who would end up in even more trouble because they couldn't pay. "Do you understand the fine, Miss Williams?" Emily asked, finally looking up at Grace for the first time during the entire proceeding. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," Grace replied quietly, her voice steady despite her disappointment. Emily nodded and made a note in her file. I hope this experience teaches you to respect the law and think about the consequences of your actions. You have 30 days to pay the fine." Grace nodded once more. "Thank you, Your Honor." As Grace turned to leave the courtroom, Emily was already calling for the next case. She felt satisfied that she had delivered proper justice and taught someone an important lesson about personal responsibility. She had no idea that she had just treated one of the country's most respected human rights lawyers with unfair judgment and unconscious bias. Grace walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, carrying the weight of the unfair treatment she had just received. She had spent years fighting for justice and equality, but she had just experienced firsthand how the system could fail people based on assumptions and prejudice. Emily Harrison remained at her bench, completely unaware that her harsh words and excessive fine had just affected someone who had dedicated her life to making the justice system more fair for everyone. Judge Emily Harrison stood in front of her bedroom mirror that evening, adjusting her pearl necklace and smoothing down her navy blue evening dress. She had been looking forward to the annual legal conference dinner for weeks. It was one of the biggest events of the year for judges and lawyers in London, and she always enjoyed the opportunity to network with her colleagues and discuss important legal matters. The conference was being held at the Grand Palace Hotel, one of the most expensive and elegant hotels in central London. Emily had attended this event for the past 8 years, and she knew it would be filled with the most important people in the British legal system. She grabbed her small evening purse and headed out into the cool London evening when Emily arrived. At the hotel, she was impressed as always by the beautiful ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and round tables covered with white tablecloths were ranged throughout the room. Each table was decorated with fresh flowers and expensive china. The atmosphere was sophisticated and formal, exactly what Emily expected from such a prestigious event. Emily found her assigned table and greeted the other judges and lawyers who were already seated. She recognized most of them from previous conferences and court proceedings. They chatted about recent cases, changes in the law, and upcoming judicial appointments, while waiters served appetizers and filled their wine glasses. This year's keynote speaker is supposed to be exceptional, said Judge Thompson, an older man who worked in the same courthouse as Emily. "I've heard wonderful things about her work in human rights law." Emily nodded politely while sipping her wine. She was curious about the speaker, but was more interested in the networking opportunities the evening would provide. She had several cases coming up that might benefit from discussions with her colleagues. As the main course was being served, the event organizer, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, walked up to the microphone at the front of the room. She tapped it gently to get everyone's attention, and the conversations round the tables gradually quieted down. "Good evening, distinguished guests," the organizer began with a warm smile. "I hope you're all enjoying this beautiful evening and the excellent food. Now, it's time for the highlight of our conference, our keynote address." Emily put down her fork and turned her attention to the stage. "Along with the other 300 guests in the ballroom tonight, we are honored to have one of Britain's most accomplished and respected human rights lawyers," the organizer continued. "She has argued cases before the Supreme Court, advised government officials on criminal justice reform, and has dedicated her career to fighting for equality and justice for all people." Emily felt mildly interested, but was still thinking about the conversation she wanted to have with other judges after the speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Grace Williams." The name hit Emily like a bolt of lightning. Her wine glass, which had been halfway to her lips, froze in midair. Her eyes widened in shock as she watched the same woman she had lectured and fined that very morning walk confidently onto the stage. But this was a completely different Grace Williams than the one Emily had seen in her courtroom. Gone was the simple blue dress and nervous posture. Instead, Grace wore an elegant black evening dress that fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled beautifully, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged on that stage. She looked like the accomplished professional she truly was. Emily's heart began to race as the horrible reality of her mistake became clear. The woman she had treated with such condescension and disrespect was not only a lawyer, but one of the most respected human rights advocates in the entire country. Grace began her speech with a warm smile and a strong, clear voice that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here with so many dedicated servants of justice." Emily felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she remembered her harsh words from that morning. She had assumed Grace was uneducated and irresponsible, but here she was, speaking eloquently about complex legal issues. The justice system works best when we see the humanity in everyone who enters our courtrooms, Grace continued, her voice carrying easily through the large ballroom. "When we make assumptions based on appearance or background, we fail in our duty to serve justice." Equally, each word felt like it was directed straight at Emily. She realized that Grace was speaking about exactly the kind of bias Emily had shown that morning. The irony was almost unbearable. Grace went on to discuss her work with the Supreme Court, her efforts to reform the criminal justice system, and her passion for defending the rights of marginalized people. She spoke about cases she had won that had changed lives and policies that had improved fairness. In the court's dot as the speech continued, Emily felt herself shrinking in her chair. She had treated this brilliant, accomplished woman with such disrespect and condescension. She had made assumptions based solely on Grace's appearance, and had delivered the harshest possible punishment without any consideration for her circumstances. When Grace finished her speech, the entire ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause. Everyone stood up to give her a standing ovation, clapping and cheering for whole minutes. Emily remained seated, too shocked and ashamed to move. She was lost in thought about the terrible mistake she had made and the unfair treatment she had given to someone who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. After Grace finished her powerful speech, the applause continued for several minutes. Emily Harrison sat frozen in her chair, watching as people crowded round Grace to congratulate her and ask questions. Emily's mind was racing with thoughts of shame and regret about how she had treated this remarkable woman just hours earlier. The crowd in the ballroom began to thin out. Emily slowly made her way toward the hotel bar. Her legs felt shaky, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She ordered a glass of water from the bartender, but her hands were trembling so much she could barely hold it steady. Emily knew she had to apologize to Grace, but she had no idea how to begin such a difficult conversation. What could she possibly say to make up for the way she had treated her? How could she explain her behavior without sounding like she was making excuses? The more she thought about it, the more nervous she became. She watched from across the room as Grace spoke with small groups of lawyers and judges. Everyone seemed eager to talk with her, asking questions about her work and seeking her advice on legal matters. Grace handled each conversation with grace and intelligence, giving thoughtful answers and listening carefully to what others had to say. Emily noticed that Grace never seemed rushed or impatient, even when people asked her the same questions repeatedly. She treated everyone with the same kindness and respect, whether they were senior judges or young lawyers just starting their careers. This made Emily feel even worse about her own behavior that morning. After about 30 minutes, Emily saw her chance. Grace had just finished talking with a group of law students and was walking toward the lobby area. Emily took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward. Even though every step felt difficult, Dr. Williams, Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She was standing a few feet away from Grace, not sure if she should come closer. Grace turned round and looked at Emily with eyes that seemed both kind and knowing. Emily could tell that Grace recognized her immediately, but there was no anger or hostility in her expression. "Might I have a word with you privately?" Emily asked, her voice still shaking slightly. Grace studied Emily's face for a moment, seeming to understand the importance of the request. "Of course, Judge Harrison," she replied in a calm, professional tone. They walked together toward a quieter corner of the hotel lobby, away from the crowds of people who were still leaving the conference. Emily's palms were sweating, and she wiped them nervously on her dress as they found two comfortable chairs near a large window. Emily sat down and took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to begin the conversation she knew she needed to have. Grace sat across from her, waiting patiently without saying anything. Her expression was neutral but attentive, giving Emily the space she needed to speak. "I owe you a sincere apology for this morning," Emily began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I treated you unfairly, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior." Grace listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but not angry. She didn't interrupt or try to make Emily feel better about what had happened. She simply waited for Emily to continue. "I made assumptions about you based on—" Emily paused, struggling to find the right words. "Well, based on how you looked and the fact that you didn't have a lawyer with you, I was completely wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Emily felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized the full impact of what she had done. She had not only treated Grace unfairly, but she had also failed in her duty as a judge to be impartial and just. Grace was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider her response carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but honest. "Thank you for your apology, Judge Harrison. I appreciate that you're willing to acknowledge what happened." Grace paused and looked out the window at the busy London street before continuing. "Your treatment of me this morning wasn't unusual. Unfortunately, many people who look like me face similar assumptions every day, whether they're in courtrooms, offices, or just walking down the street." Emily felt her heart sink even further. She had thought of herself as a fair and unbiased judge, but Grace's words made her realize that she had been contributing to a much larger problem. "But that's no excuse for my behavior," Emily said, her voice filled with regret. "I'm supposed to be impartial. I'm supposed to treat everyone equally, regardless of their background or appearance." Grace nodded slowly. "You're human, Judge Harrison. We all have biases, even when we don't realize it. The important question is what we do when we recognize them." Grace leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "I could afford that £600 fine you gave me, but many others can't. That's why this matters so much. When judges make assumptions or impose harsh penalties based on bias, it can destroy people's lives." Emily felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she fully understood the impact of her actions. "How can I do better?" she asked, her voice barely audible. For the first time since they had sat down, Grace smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile that gave Emily a small glimmer of hope. "The fact that you're asking that question is a very good start, Judge Harrison." The days following the conference were difficult for Judge Emily Harrison. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying her conversation with Grace over and over in her mind. The shame and regret she felt were overwhelming. But more than that, she was deeply concerned about what Grace had told her. If her treatment of Grace wasn't unusual, then how many other people had she treated unfairly without even realizing it? Emily decided she needed to take a hard look at her own behavior as a judge. She spent an entire weekend in her home office, going through boxes of old case files and court records. What she discovered made her feel sick to her stomach. As she carefully reviewed case after case, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. When she compared how she had treated defendants from different backgrounds, she realized that she had been consistently harsher with people from minority communities. Black defendants, in particular, had received higher fines and longer sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. Emily stared at the numbers in front of her, unable to believe what she was seeing. In traffic violation cases, she had given black drivers fines that were on average 40% higher than those given to white drivers. In petty theft cases, black defendants were twice as likely to receive jail time instead of community service. The evidence was clear and undeniable. She had always thought of herself as a fair and impartial judge, but the facts told a different story. She had been unconsciously letting her biases influence her decisions, and this had real consequences for people's lives. The next Monday morning, Emily called her assistant and asked her to research unconscious bias training programs in London. She enrolled in a 3-day workshop that would help her understand how hidden prejudices could affect decision-making. She also ordered several books about racial justice and the history of discrimination in the legal system. The training was eye-opening and sometimes uncomfortable. Emily learned about the ways that unconscious bias could influence everything from how she interpreted body language to how she assessed the credibility of witnesses. She discovered that even well-meaning people could act in discriminatory ways without realizing it. After completing the training, Emily felt like she needed more help. She remembered Grace's kind words about being willing to learn and grow. Taking a deep breath, Emily picked up her phone and called Grace's office. "Dr. Williams, this is Judge Harrison," Emily said nervously when Grace answered. "I was wondering if you might have time to meet with me. I'd like to ask for your guidance on how I can improve my courtroom practices." Grace was quiet for a moment, and Emily worried that she might say no. But then Grace replied with warmth in her voice, "I'd be happy to help. Judge Harrison, would you like to meet for coffee this week?" They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the courthouse. Emily arrived early, feeling nervous but determined to do whatever it took to become a better judge. When Grace arrived, she greeted Emily with a genuine smile and seemed pleased that Emily was taking such concrete steps to change. "I've been thinking about what you said," Emily began after they had ordered their coffee, "about how my treatment of you wasn't unusual. I looked at my own records, and I was horrified by what I found." Grace listened carefully as Emily described the pattern she had discovered in her sentencing. Grace nodded thoughtfully, not seeming surprised by what Emily was telling her. "It takes courage to look at yourself so honestly," Grace said. "Most people would rather not know about their biases. But what can I do about it?" Emily asked. "How can I make sure this doesn't happen again?" Grace leaned forward, her expression becoming more animated. "Small changes can make a big difference," she explained. "For example, consider offering community service instead of high fines for minor offenses. Many people simply can't afford large penalties, and when they can't pay, they end up in even more trouble." This made perfect sense to Emily. She had never really thought about how a fine that seemed reasonable to her might be impossible for someone living paycheck to paycheck. "You could also implement sliding scale fines based on income," Grace continued, "and take more time to understand each defendant's individual circumstances before making decisions." Over the following weeks, Emily and Grace began meeting regularly. Emily found herself looking forward to these conversations, which were helping her see the justice system through completely different eyes. Grace was patient and encouraging, never making Emily feel stupid for not understanding something sooner. Emily started implementing the changes Grace had suggested. She began asking defendants about their financial situations before imposing fines. She expanded the community service options available in her courtroom. She made sure to take more time with each case, really listening to what people had to say instead of rushing through her decisions. The results were immediate and noticeable. Defendants in Emily's courtroom began to seem less afraid and more hopeful. They were being treated with dignity and respect, and they could sense that the judge was genuinely trying to understand their situations. Other judges in the courthouse started commenting on the changes in Emily's courtroom. Repeat. Offenses were decreasing because people weren't getting trapped in cycles of debt from unpaid fines. The atmosphere in her courtroom had become more positive and constructive. Grace began visiting Emily's courtroom occasionally, sitting quietly in the back and observing the improvements. After one particularly successful day, Grace approached Emily with a warm smile. "You've come so far," Grace told her. "I'm proud of the changes you've made." Emily felt tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I had a good teacher. Thank you for not giving up on me." 6 months had passed since that life-changing evening at the legal conference. Judge Emily Harrison stood backstage at the same Grand Palace Hotel. But this time she wasn't alone. Grace Williams stood beside her, both women wearing professional suits and holding notes for the presentation they were about to give together. Emily's hands were shaking slightly, but not from shame or fear like they had been months earlier. This time, she was nervous because she was about to share her story of transformation with hundreds of her peers. She was going to admit publicly that she had been biased and unfair. And she was going to explain how she had worked to change. "Are you ready for this?" Grace asked. Noticing Emily's nervousness, Emily took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so. It's still hard to talk about my mistakes, but I know it's important." The same event organizer who had introduced Grace 6 months earlier stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special presentation about judicial reform and unconscious bias. Please welcome Judge Emily Harrison and Dr. Grace Williams." The two women walked onto the stage together, and Emily felt a surge of gratitude for Grace's friendship and support. The audience applauded politely, many of them curious about what these two very different women would have to say. Emily stepped up to the microphone first. Her voice was steady and clear as she began to speak. "6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake. I treated a defendant in my courtroom unfairly because of my unconscious biases. That defendant was Dr. Grace Williams, and I'm here today to tell you how that mistake changed my life." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Emily could see surprise and interest on the faces of judges and lawyers she had known for years. "Change begins with recognition," Emily continued. "I had to face the uncomfortable truth about my own biases before I could become a better judge. It was painful and humbling, but it was necessary." Grace stepped forward to join Emily at the microphone. "Judge Harrison's willingness to examine her own behavior and make changes shows us something important," Grace said. "Institutions change when individuals have the courage to examine their practices and make improvements." For the next 30 minutes, Emily and Grace told their story together. They explained how Emily had discovered the patterns of bias in her own courtroom, how she had sought training and guidance, and how she had implemented new practices that were making a real difference in people's lives. They shared statistics showing how repeat offenses had decreased in Emily's courtroom and how defendants were responding more positively to the changes. They talked about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. When they finished their presentation, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Many judges and lawyers stood up, clearly moved by what they had heard. Emily felt tears of relief and pride in her eyes as she looked out at the crowd. After the presentation, Emily and Grace were surrounded by colleagues asking questions and seeking advice. Judge Thompson, who had sat at Emily's table during the original conference, approached them with genuine admiration. "I had no idea you were going through such a transformation," he said to Emily. "This is exactly the kind of change our justice system needs." A young female judge from Manchester asked Grace, "How can we start this kind of program in our own courts?" Grace smiled warmly. "Start with honest self-examination. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Change is possible when we're willing to work for it." As the crowd began to thin out, Emily and Grace gathered their materials and prepared to leave. They had somewhere important to go, a place that represented the next chapter in their partnership. They walked through the busy streets of London together, talking and laughing like old friends. The afternoon sun was shining, and Emily felt lighter than she had in months. She was no longer carrying the heavy burden of shame and regret that had weighed on her for so long. Who would have thought that a traffic ticket would lead to all this? Grace said with a laugh as they turned onto a quiet side street. Emily smiled, shaking her head in amazement. "I'm grateful for that day, even though I'm not proud of how I behaved. It changed my life completely." They stopped in front of a modest building with a freshly painted sign that read Community Legal Aid Clinic. This was their newest project, a place where people who couldn't afford lawyers could get free legal help. Emily and Grace had worked together for months to make this clinic a reality. Inside, the clinic was bustling with activity. Young lawyers who had volunteered their time were meeting with clients, helping them understand their rights and navigate the legal system. Community members who had never had access to legal help were getting the assistance they desperately needed. Emily watched a young volunteer lawyer explaining housing rights to an elderly woman who was facing eviction. At another table, a man was getting help with a wrongful termination case. These were the people who had been failed by the justice system in the past. And now, they were getting the help they deserved. As Emily and Grace observed the scene, Emily felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before in her career. She had learned that true justice wasn't about punishment or showing how tough she could be. Real justice was about understanding, compassion, giving everyone a fair chance. Grace put her hand on Emily's shoulder and smiled. "This is just the beginning. Together, we can help make the justice system work for everyone." Emily nodded, feeling hopeful about the future. Their friendship had grown from a moment of terrible bias into something beautiful and meaningful. They had proven that change was possible, and they were committed to continuing this important work together. The end.